It's late 1939, and World War II has just erupted in Europe. The Royal Navy dominates the seas around Britain, blocking every safe route home for Hitler's Kriegsmarine. For the German tanker Altmark, stationed in the South Atlantic, this is the worst possible scenario. Captain Heinrich Dau, the man the British call the nastiest Nazi who ever sailed the seas, sits on her bridge, staring at a dispatch. Things keep getting worse. His companion vessel, Admiral Graf Spee, has been scuttled off Montevideo. Now, Dau sails unprotected and alone. He could vanish into South America, abandon ship, and slip away from the Royal Navy patrols, hunting him across the open seas. But he knows Altmark is too valuable to his Führer. One way or another, he must get her back to Germany. The enemy closes from beyond the horizon, but below deck, a bigger threat brews as the most dangerous cargo grows restless. The sailors aboard the British freighter SS Clement had been warned, do not call for help. But as the German warship closed in, the radio operators had no other option. They slammed their fists onto the transmitter, broadcasting an urgent RRR distress call. The ship was under attack. But before they could finish relaying their coordinates, bullets raked across the deck. The low-swooping Arado AR-196 float plane opened fire with its machine guns, sending men running for cover. Captain Frederick Harris gave the order to abandon ship. Nearly 50 men scrambled into lifeboats, casting off into the Atlantic and setting course for Brazil. Harris stayed behind, bound by honor to Clement, as the enemy closed in. Captain Hans Langsdorff, commander of the German cruiser Admiral Graf Spee, sent his men aboard. It was September 30th, 1939, and he had just been commanded by the Führer to take his pocket battleship out to the South Atlantic in search of vulnerable enemy merchant ships. Langsdorff took Harris aboard the Graf Spee as a prisoner. Behind them, the German guns pummeled the Clement with shell fire. From Graf Spee's deck, Captain Harris watched his ship for the last time as it vanished into the water. In the weeks that followed, more British vessels fell, hunted down one by one. One of Graf Spee's largest victims was the SS Huntsman, an 8,000-ton freighter laden with goods from the east. Graf Spee closed in, diesel engines pushing her to 20 knots. She cut off escape routes and pointed her weapons at the freighter, ordering her 84-man crew to evacuate before they sank the ship. Despite the brutality Captain Langsdorff showed in combat, he was also a man bound by honor, and he would always adhere to the ancient code of prize warfare. No matter how many vessels he sank, every foreign sailor would be rescued. With each victory, the decks of the Graf Spee grew heavier with captured men. Supplies began to dwindle as the ship became dangerously overloaded. Langsdorff needed a solution. Then, the answer to his problems arrived on the open sea in the form of the German oil tanker Altmark. Originally commissioned to shadow the Graf Spee across the Atlantic, the Altmark had served as a lifeline, routinely delivering fuel and munitions to the cruiser. But now, Langsdorff saw a new purpose for the vessel: a floating prison. Hundreds of captured Allied sailors were transported onto the oiler. They were locked below in cramped 10-foot storage compartments, barely lit and with no proper ventilation. Only once a day were they allowed to climb up for a breath of the open sea, flanked by rifles to ensure they would not attempt to revolt. Captain Heinrich Dau, Altmark's commander, made no secret of his loathing. A fanatic of the Nazi regime, he despised the British captives, and he would gladly toss them overboard if the warning came. But as Langsdorff continued scoring victories, Dau had no other choice but to keep hosting prisoners. As with previous strikes, the pocket battleship hoisted an Allied flag meant to trick her victim. The Travanian was ordered to cut her engines and maintain radio silence. But the merchant crew saw through the ruse and reached for their transmitter. A salvo from Graf Spee's main guns exploded, silencing the radio and scrapping any chance for escape. Upon securing victory, the number of prisoners ballooned to nearly 300 sailors crammed aboard the Altmark. Admiral Graf Spee had become one of the most successful hunters at the Atlantic. However, Langsdorff knew that his victories came at a price. Dozens of British ships were out hunting for him. It was time to disappear. During the final months of 1939, The Admiral Graf Spee kept slipping through the grasp of the Royal Navy, sailing toward the Indian Ocean and skirting the coast of Madagascar before looping back into the South Atlantic. By December, Graf Spee had successfully eluded the hunter groups sent to capture her. However, after sailing nearly 30,000 nautical miles, the ship was exhausted and her engines on the verge of giving up. Captain Hans Langsdorff resolved to return home. However, before German officials gave his vessel the all-clear to turn around, the lookouts on board spotted 3 ships ahead as dawn broke on December 13th. These were the British heavy cruiser Exeter and her escorts, the light cruisers Ajax and Achilles. Langsdorff decided his ship still had one more hunt left in her before departing for the motherland. In the first hours of the morning, the Graf Spee opened fire with her 11-inch main guns. Shells ripped through Exeter's bridge and forward turrets. The second salvo struck Ajax, disabling her aft guns and forcing her to maneuver out of the way. Victory seemed within reach for the Germans, but Langsdorff had messed with the wrong pack. British shells slammed into Graf Spee's hull, more than 70 in total, tearing through armor, taking the lives of 36 men and wounding 60 more. Langsdorff himself was hit by shrapnel as he fought to command his men mid-assault. Realizing his tactical miscalculation, he ordered a retreat. The Graf Spee, barely able to remain afloat, turned around and set course for Montevideo, Uruguay. Once in port, Langsdorff faced the reality of his situation. The fuel purification system was destroyed, the galley and desalination plant wrecked, and the damage to the ship's bow rendered her unfit for ocean transit. There would be no return to Germany. Convinced that the British would soon come back to finish the job, Langsdorff made the only choice his honor allowed. On December 17th, he ordered the scuttling of Graf Spee. From the shore, 20,000 spectators watched in silence as the Admiral Graf Spee, once the prized raider of Hitler's Kriegsmarine, burned from bow to stern. Explosions ripped through her decks, and within minutes, she vanished beneath the waters of the River Plate. A few days later, in Buenos Aires, Captain Hans Langsdorff set out the battle ensign of his fallen ship. Dressed in full uniform, he lay atop the flag and ended his life so he could join the Graf Spee. After the demise of Admiral Graf Spee, Captain Dau, aboard the Altmark, knew it was time to make it back to Germany before he shared the same fate as Captain Langsdorff. However, making his way back would not be easy. For months, Altmark had been able to keep the facade of being just a regular oiler. However, it was only a matter of time before the British prisoners freed from the Admiral Graf Spee unmasked the Altmark as a floating prison. Soon, every ship, from the coast of Brazil to the waters of Sweden, would have an order to track and stop Dau and his ship. The captain ordered the vessel to be repainted in gray. Canvas screens and makeshift superstructures were erected to distort her silhouette in an attempt to hide her identity. With the English Channel heavily guarded by Royal Navy warships, a direct return to Germany was off the table. Dau chose a longer route instead, northward, skirting Iceland, then cutting down toward Germany through the corridors near neutral Norway. He gambled that British ships wouldn't risk a diplomatic firestorm by attacking a seemingly innocent ship sailing by a neutral zone. Below deck, the prisoners felt the shift as the oiler began heading home. If they made it back, they would vanish into Nazi prison camps. Some men began to whisper of mutiny, but the guards were armed, and any uprising would end in a massacre. Instead, they turned to more desperate methods. They scribbled messages and ship descriptions onto scraps of paper, sealed them inside bottles, and threw them into the sea during the brief minutes they were allowed on deck. But no one came to their rescue. After weeks of travel, Altmark finally reached the North Atlantic and began her descent toward Germany's shores. Against all odds, it looked like she might make it. But before Altmark could get any further, a Norwegian patrol boat approached. Its officers boarded and questioned Dau, asking why his ship was so close to Bergen's port exclusion zone. Dau kept the ruse. His ship was just a merchant tanker on her way home. The Norwegians were skeptical. Still, they had no proof, and upon a quick eye scan of the deck, they turned away. But underneath the ship, the prisoners were desperate to be found. Fourth Officer John Banmont of SS Tyroa shouted at his comrades, quote, "All together, lads. Give it all you've got." Fists and boots hammered against the wall, while voices shouted at the top of their lungs. The screams of 299 men crying out for help. Above deck, the Norwegian officers froze and turned to Dau. They demanded to know what the noise coming from under the ship was. Dau stared at the Norwegian officer. For a second, he stood frozen, not able to make a sound. But as the roar of the prisoners grew louder, he snapped back. With a practiced composure, he dismissed the sound as machinery noise, explaining, quote, "My ship is empty, and my crew are cold. The winches generate heat." The Norwegians stared at him in silence. Then, without further comment, they nodded, turned on their heels, and stepped off the Altmark. Furious at the audacity of his captives, Dau ordered fire hoses to be turned on them with crushing force. Then the lights were cut, plunging the prisoners into an endless darkness. Back aboard the Norwegian patrol craft, officers couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong with the German vessel, and before Dau could keep on sailing, they sent an urgent message back to command, quote, "The vessel has refused additional inspection. Passage through the defense area is denied. Prisoners of war are likely on board." Despite the warning, authorities allowed Altmark through the restricted corridor near Bergen, trying to get the ship out of the region as quickly as possible, even providing escort vessels to assist the oiler as it sailed through. A decision some believe made out of fear of invoking Hitler's wrath. Back in Norway, British intelligence got word about the mysterious German ship. The moment the report reached London, it was rushed to the desk of Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty. This could very well be the Altmark, and if he wanted to catch it, he needed to act fast. Churchill dispatched the 4th Destroyer Flotilla, a 6-ship task force, under the command of Captain Philip Vlan, aboard HMS Cossack. Though less than 400 feet long and dwarfed in weight by Altmark, the Tribal-class destroyer was armed with 4 twin 120mm guns, torpedo launchers, and depth charges it was ready to unleash, if the situation called for it. Churchill instructed Vlan to, quote, "Find the Altmark, edge her into the open sea, board her, and liberate her prisoners." However, no one actually knew what they were looking for, as the vessel was still under disguise, and there were no accurate descriptions of her. Still, British destroyers began to move west across the Norwegian shoreline, hoping to catch the Altmark, as it traveled in the opposite direction. They stopped and inspected numerous vessels, each false alarm chipping away at their precious time. After a series of unsuccessful inspections, the British began to worry that the ship had slipped through their fingers. However, around noon on February 16th, Captain Vlan received word from the Royal Air Force. Lockheed Hudsons, patrolling the Norwegian coast, had spotted an oiler steaming south. Captain Philip Vlan ordered destroyers HMS Intrepid and HMS Ivanhoe, as well as the light cruiser HMS Arethusa, to make flank speed and intercept the fugitive German oiler. Hours later, eyes on the ship's bridges spotted their target, a lone gray vessel shattered by 2 Norwegian gunboats, Kjell and Skarv. The British hailed the German ship and demanded that it sail into international waters. There she could be dealt with properly. But Captain Heinrich Dau refused, instead veering closer to the Norwegian coast, banking on the fact that the hands of the Royal Navy were tied by diplomacy. Still, Vlan's force pressed on. The British ships tightened their formation, maneuvering to wedge themselves between Altmark and her neutral escorts. Norwegian protests came over the radio. But the British sailors didn't stop trying to get Altmark away from the shore. HMS Intrepid wheeled around, trained her guns on Altmark, and unleashed a volley of warning shots. Shells passed overhead, crashing onto nearby Norwegian soil. Outmaneuvered and flanked by the enemy, Dau was pushed toward a dead end by the entrance of the Jøssingfjord, a narrow passageway surrounded by mountains with no exit. Knowing any attempt to turn south would inevitably lead to capture, Altmark's captain made the decision to go into the fjord. His vessel turned sharply and smashed through layers of brittle surface ice as she pushed deeper into the mouth of the fjord. Eventually, thicker ice forced the oiler to halt. At the fjord's entrance, the Norwegian gunboats blocked British ships from entering. Any further advance, they warned, would be met with force. After the rest of the flotilla arrived, Captain Philip Vlan stepped forward and met with Norwegian officers, laying out the situation and trying to negotiate a compromise. Let the Altmark be escorted back to Bergen, where she would be thoroughly searched under Norwegian authority with a British sailor on board. But the Norwegians stood their ground. According to the officials, the ship had already been inspected, and there were no signs of prisoners on board. Unsure as to how to proceed, Bland returned to his ship and got back in touch with the Admiralty. Winston Churchill let the captain know where he stood, quote, "Board Altmark, liberate the prisoners, and take possession of the ship, pending further instructions. If Norwegian torpedo boats fire upon you, do not respond unless the attack is serious. If so, defend yourself, and use no more force than necessary." As darkness began to descend upon the fjord, Captain Philip Bland gave the order. HMS Cossack was going back into the fjord. As the destroyer made her way across the icy water, Norwegian gunboats hailed her once again, warning that she must turn around immediately. But Bland was done asking permission, and standing firm on the bridge, he radioed back to the Norwegians, letting them know that if they were going to fire, they ought to do it now, because one way or another, he and his ship were coming through. And so Cossack began to push between the Norwegian escorts, slipping past them into Jøssingfjord. As Bland and his men sailed next to the foreign gunboats, the crew held their breath. A single flash could trigger an international crisis. But as the ship sailed forward, the Norwegians held their fire. As Cossack entered the heart of the fjord, Bland could spot his target, sitting still above the frozen water. Bland told the Germans to prepare to be boarded. Inside Altmark, all hell broke loose. German sailors rushed below decks, tearing up documents, burning sensitive papers, and trying to purge the ship of anything the British might seize. Captain Dau debated whether to scuttle the ship, but to do so would mean taking out the nearly 300 British prisoners locked below. A move far too risky. Instead, he opted for one last strike against his hunters. As Cossack came within boarding range, Altmark suddenly lurched into motion, her engines roaring to full reverse. The massive oiler swung back, set to ram her stern into the smaller British destroyer behind her and crush her side on. On Cossack's bridge, Bland saw the motion and immediately ordered his men to turn hard to port. The British ship followed the command, scraping against the frozen rocks as she dodged the oncoming bulk. Altmark's steel hull slammed into Cossack's port side, but only glanced off of it, leaving nothing but a scrape on her hull. As both ships shuddered from the impacts and settled, they came to rest side by side. Bland turned to his men and gave the order. From Cossack's deck, Lieutenant Commander Bradwell T. Turner stepped forward, revolver drawn. Without hesitation, he leapt across the gap, separating both ships, landing hard on Altmark's deck. Behind him, dozens of armed British sailors followed. Over 30 British sailors landed on the Altmark's stern and began moving forward with weapons at the ready. Before they could get too far, a squad of German sailors surged from the shadows. Bullets ricocheted off bulkheads and sliced through the air as they brushed past the British sailors. As the opposing teams clashed, the firefight collapsed into a melee. Fists and bayonet butts pummeled faces as men grappled in hand-to-hand combat amid the decks. The Germans, loyal to the ship they'd guarded across half the world, gave it their all to protect their vessel. But there was simply no way for them to outpower the Royal Navy. The British edge in close combat became evident quickly, and the German defense began to crumble. One by one, Altmark's defenders fell, disarmed, beaten, or wounded. Some dropped their weapons and raised their hands, knowing the fight was lost. But a handful, unwilling to surrender their ship, made a last-ditch attempt to escape. They charged toward the shoreline, desperate to ground the vessel before the British could claim it. Cossack sailors gave chase and caught them in time, but not before Altmark, still under momentum, plowed into the fjord's shallow edge, its hull screeching against the icy seabed. The ship came to a halt, stuck fast in the frozen mud. She was no longer going anywhere. Altmark had fallen. In total, the British had claimed 4 German lives and wounded 4 others at the cost of 1 of their own. But the mission was not yet complete. The British boarding team swept below deck, searching through the corridors and storage compartments. The sailor shouted into the darkness, quote, "Any Englishmen down there?" A chorus of voices rose from below, quote, "Yes, yes, we're here." The reply was immediate, quote, "Come up then. The Navy is here. 299 British sailors emerged from the bowels of Altmark, unshaven, exhausted, filthy, but grinning with joy. Their nightmare was over. They were swiftly ferried aboard HMS Cossack, which turned about and sailed back toward Britain, leaving the stranded Altmark and her crew behind. From the grounded oiler, Captain Heinrich Dau stood in silence, watching as the prisoners he had guarded for months were taken from him in a single night. His mission had ended in defeat. The next day, Cossack entered British waters. The freed sailors stood on deck, arms raised and hats waving in the air. For the first time in months, Britain had a victory worth celebrating. In the days following the liberation of Altmark's prisoners, Norway's government issued protests against Britain's actions in hopes of keeping its neutrality intact. However, appeasing Hitler was never an option. In Berlin, Altmark's failure was seen not as defeat, but as a call to action. Adolf Hitler, who had already begun crafting the blueprint for the invasion of Norway and Denmark, decided it was time to accelerate his plans. On April 9, 1940, less than 2 months after the Altmark incident, German forces unleashed a blitzkrieg from the fjords to the Danish Isles. Within weeks, both nations had fallen. Norway became a Nazi fortress, ensuring that no British destroyer could again chase a German vessel through its waters in the years to come. As a final insult, the occupying Germans mounted a sign at the mouth of Jøssingfjord, where HMS Cossack had stormed Altmark. It read, quote, "Here, on February 16, 1940, the Altmark was set upon by a British sea pirate." That sign remained in place throughout the war. When the Allies finally liberated Norway, and the plaque was removed, it was given to Admiral Philip Bland, the man who had boarded Altmark, freed 299 men, and warned the Nazis never to mess with the British Navy.